think I just peed a little.
A phrase which has more or less lost all of its meaning in recent discussions on film criticism is the term subverting expectations. Without a shadow of a doubt, the term was ballooned into popularity by Star Wars: The Last Jedi. The subversions in that film were one of the many aspects of that film which some audiences praised while other audiences hated. Since the term has mainly been used in regards to poor subversion, many people look at the term with general negativity, which is a shame considering that subverting expectations is not an inherently flawed concept. Some of the best moments in recent movies and TV shows have been generated through surprising the audience with subversion, but there is a way to effectively execute subversion and a way to fumble it. Star Wars: The Last Jedi has been picked apart in every imaginable way, and I hate to keep using it as an example for writing, but there are perfect examples of how not to subvert expectations found in the film. For instance, a subversion in the film which has great potential is the decision to kill the main antagonist of the film in order to make way for a new villain. This can and has been achieved in several different movies with varying effects. A flaw in the film which many cite in the throne room scene is the fact that Snoke wasn't given a backstory before he died. However, this flaw only relates to the universe of the sequel trilogy. Looking beyond Snoke's backstory and position in the plot of the film, the subversion itself is executed quite well. It comes at the hands of Snoke's apprentice and is revealed to the audience in a shocking way. However, there is a reason that this subversion isn't effective. The scene is missing two elements which make for effective subversion: setup and consequences. In order to properly subvert the audience's expectations, there needs to be hints for the audience to pick up on as foreshadowing, or details which the audience will realize they didn't think of. Aside from the brief scene early in the film where Snoke belittles Kylo, there aren't any hints through dialogue that Kylo seeks to eventually take over for Snoke. In addition to this, the rule of two is something which fans of Star Wars will be familiar with, particularly if they've seen the prequel trilogy.
There's no doubt the mysterious warrior was a Sith.
Always two there are. No more, no less. A master and an apprentice.
Because of this, the action of Kylo killing Snoke feels somewhat arbitrary. Beyond the setup, the scene features no lasting consequences. Kylo and Rey overpower Snoke's guards, but aside from this, neither of them chooses to alter their philosophy, and Kylo's actions do not cause any turmoil or political unrest throughout the rest of the film's plot. Because of this, the subversion of Snoke's death represents a brilliantly executed payoff, but the payoff has almost no setup and absolutely no consequences. On the other hand, if you would like the perfect case study of how to effectively subvert expectations, there is no better place to look than the early seasons of Game of Thrones. I opened this video with one of my favorite minor subversions in the show. At the end of the episode Hard Home, Jon Snow comes face to face with a White Walker warrior. Jon is searching for dragonglass in the hut, which as far as he and the audience are aware is the key to killing the White Walkers. While he is searching, Loboda confronts the White Walker and this happens. Before Jon can grab the glass, he is thrown by the White Walker and loses Longclaw. After running upstairs, he picks up a random sword only for it to shatter just like Loboda's axe. Battered and bruised, he runs only to lose his footing. Then... The reason that this is an effective subversion is the details director Miguel Sapochnik poured into the fight. The key detail which the audience will recall after seeing the payoff is that Jon lost Longclaw at the beginning of the fight. What the focus of the fight emphasizes is that the White Walker's sword shatters weapons. Both Loboda and Jon use a normal weapon against it and the same result occurs. Based on the information the audience has been presented with, the expectation is that Longclaw will shatter just like the other swords and that Jon will die. But these expectations are subverted. The consequences and lasting payoff of this scene is that Jon realizes that Valyrian steel is also effective against the White Walkers. We later learn that this is because Valyrian steel is formed from dragonfire, same as dragonglass. It's a small subversion, but it achieves the three keys to successful subversion. There is setup in the fight through the use of weapons, payoff in the subversion of the audience's expectations that the weapon will shatter, and consequences through Jon realizing the hidden power of Valyrian steel. Early on, subverting expectations was something which Game of Thrones did perfectly nearly every time. However, as the show progressed, the rushing of the show's pace began making the subversions less effective. Thus, there are examples of both effective and poor subversions which can be found in the show as a whole. I'd like to take a look at three more subversions. One significant subversion from Season 1, one from Season 7, and one from Season 8. Many credit the death of Ned Stark as being one of the most shocking and well-executed moments in TV history. The reason that this subversion is so effective is because of the expectations that audiences familiar with the fantasy genre have in regards to protagonistic characters. Fantasy stories tend to revolve around a knight in shining armor character. In the context of the show, Jon Snow represents the underdog character, a noble character who has simply undergone hardship and needs to wade through the mud in order to achieve glory. Ned Stark, on the other hand, represents a character who comes from nobility yet denies his place. The reason for this is because of his relentless honor. Similarly to Steve Rogers in the MCU, Ned refuses to look the other way or compromise his beliefs for the greater good. This is in direct conflict with the small council members including Renly, Varys, Littlefinger, and Grand Maester Pycelle, who either seek to serve the realm or slowly grasp at greater power. When Ned arrives at King's Landing to help Robert, it's clear that the conflict between the Lannisters and Baratheons is escalating. Before Robert dies, Ned learns that Joffrey was born of incest from Jaime and Cersei.
Robert Baratheon, black of hair. Joffrey Baratheon, golden head.
It's a moral quandary which results in Ned being arrested for treason after he reveals the truth to Cersei and attempts to stop the Lannisters from ascending to the throne. This situation is familiar for audiences. It's the moment in the hero's journey where the hero reaches their lowest point as the result of a character flaw. But later in the story, the hero manages to pull through because they can look beyond their wants and come to realize their needs. It's the basic expectation the audience has that the story will continue, since writers are oftentimes tied to classical storytelling tropes in order to tell a coherent story. For the first time in the show, Ned compromises for the sake of his family and confesses to his crimes against the throne.
I come before you to confess my treason. In the sight of gods and men, I betrayed the faith of my king and the trust of my friend Robert. I swore to protect and defend his children, but before his blood was cold, I plotted to murder his son and seize the throne for myself.
From the first part of Joffrey's speech, it seems that Ned may live having sacrificed his honor.
My mother wishes me to let Lord Eddard join the Night's Watch. Stripped of all titles and powers, he would serve the realm in permanent exile.
However,
so long as I am your king, treason shall never go unpunished. Sir Ilyn, bring me his head.
This subversion goes against classical fantasy storytelling tropes. The reason that this subversion works is the same reason that the Valyrian Steel subversion works. The subversion is based on details and established character traits. Ned Stark is someone who refused relentlessly to surrender his honor. Rather than stick by his moral roots, he abandons them for the good of his family. In spite of his sacrifice, Joffrey chose to kill him. In some respects, Joffrey's decision did come from nowhere. However, the show had clearly established in previous scenes that Joffrey was both sadistic and impulsive. He was someone who sought power and hated people who opposed him in even the smallest ways.
I won't hurt him. Much. I'll gut you, you little cunt!
Thus, this cruel use of his power as the new king of the Seven Kingdoms is based on his previously established character traits. In addition to this subversion comes with consequences as it more or less kicks the show into high gear. Robb Stark vows to kill the Lannisters for Joffrey's actions and continues in his conquest of the Seven Kingdoms.
I'll kill them all. Every one of them. I'm gonna kill them all.
They have your sisters. We have to get the girls back.
It's also the reason that Tywin names Tyrion Hand of the King, as he wishes for Joffrey to be controlled for his impulsiveness, where Cersei proves incapable.
You will go to King's Landing.
And do what?
Rule. You will serve as Hand of the King in my stead. You'll bring that boy king to heel and his mother too, if needs be. And if you get so much as a whiff of treason from any of the rest, Baelish, Varys, Pycelle...
Head spikes walls.
Furthermore, it decreases the leverage that the Lannisters hold over the Stark house, as they lost both Ned and Arya, who fled from King's Landing. All of these story threads are consequences which result from this subversion and play a crucial role in the storytelling of later seasons. On the other hand, a death with similar concepts used is Littlefinger's death from Season 7. Littlefinger had been built up as a cunning character who was power-hungry but always knew his boundaries. Despite expressing multiple times that he desired the throne, he was patient and methodical in his choices and strategies to gain power.
Whenever I consider an action, I ask myself, Will this action help to make this picture a reality? And I only act if the answer is yes. A picture of me on the Iron Throne. And you by my side.
Season 7, however, follows Littlefinger as he attempts to convince Sansa that Arya seeks to kill her and take her place as Lady of Winterfell. In order to do this, he strings together a series of clues which are rather obvious. As a result, Sansa tricks Littlefinger into standing trial in what he believes to be Arya's trial. Confronted with a series of crimes, Littlefinger is killed by Arya while he begs for mercy. This subversion is not effective for several reasons. This subversion does feature setup and details which build to it, but the clues and dialogue with Littlefinger are out of character as they are rather blatant and obvious. His plan to convince Sansa that Arya was power-hungry is something which is far too overt for Littlefinger to commit to. He had been established throughout the series as someone who always had a card up his sleeve and kept conflict at a distance. In addition to this, Arya acts out of character in her conversation sequences with Sansa in order to trick the audience. Following Littlefinger's death, her strange behavior is never referenced again.
Now he's dead, killed by the Lannisters, with your help. That's your pretty handwriting? I would have let them kill me before I betrayed my family.
They told me it was the only way to save Father.
And you were stupid enough to believe them.
What's she going to do with that letter?
I don't know yet.
Who did you show it to? Where did you find it?
You're scared, aren't you?
Sometimes anger makes people do unfortunate things.
Sometimes fear makes them do unfortunate things. I'll go with anger.
This scene in particular is incredibly bizarre to rewatch, knowing that Arya is later revealed to not be insane. She acts similarly to a serial killer and matches what Littlefinger describes Arya is to Sansa.
Not what you're looking for.
How do you like it?
I have hundreds of men here at Winterfell, all loyal to me.
They're not here now. With the faces I can choose, I can become someone else. I could even become you.
I just need a chance to think things over.
You've had your whole fucking life to think things over. What good's a few minutes more gonna do you now?
To be the Lady of Winterfell, all I need to find out is your face.
Kind of forgot about.
These are examples of clues which turn on a dime during the subversion. They are recontextualized in a way which is illogical, as it is at odds with the basic assumption that the characters in the show will behave naturally. In addition to this, Littlefinger accepting defeat and begging for mercy is something which is wildly out of character for him during his execution. There are ways to place him in a position where he cannot think his way out of a bad situation, but there are several methods which Littlefinger could have used which the show ignores, and there are contradictive clues in the setup which make this subversion frustrating. Lastly, this death has little to no consequences. Littlefinger and his death are almost never mentioned again by the other characters, and Arya and Sansa murdering him does not feature any lasting political consequences which affect the final season. This subversion features many examples of lazy writing. There are examples of foreshadowing and details which are supposed to hint to the audience that this subversion will come. But these hints are recontextualized during the subversion and before it are at odds with the characters. There are no lasting consequences for Littlefinger's death, and the setup is filled with examples of weak writing, making this an example of a weak subversion of expectations.
Earlier, you conspired to murder Jon Arryn. You gave Lysa tears of Lys to poison him. Do you deny it?
And I would have gotten away with it too, if it weren't for you meddling kids.
While Season 7 featured examples of weak writing, Season 8 has examples of incompetent and poor writing. The many subversions found in the penultimate episode, The Bells, are far too extensive to break down as a part of this video and would require their own video to dismantle. However, an earlier subversion which many cite as being the key moment which more or less derailed the show was the climax of The Long Night. The episode ends with the Night King confronting Bran in the Godswood. The previous scenes had montaged every character in the battle shown being either killed, cornered, or mortally wounded. Thus, this scene is at a point in the episode where it seems that Bran is going to be killed. But as he reaches for his sword, presumably to strike at Bran, Arya leaps at the Night King seemingly from thin air. For an instant, the Night King stops her, but she drops the dagger and uses it with her other hand to strike the killing blow. This results in the entire army of the dead being reduced to splinters of ice. This subversion is bad for a number of reasons. The first is a lack of proper setup that Arya would be the one who killed the Night King. She had never learned that the army of the dead was real for at least 6 of the show's 8 seasons. In all of that time, she didn't believe they were anything more than scary stories told by old Nan. There were no scenes implying that she had any connection to the Night King or in some way was destined to defeat it. The episode did its best to hand-wave the lack of setup by using Melisandre's brief explanation about her closing eyes.
You said I'd shut many eyes forever. You were right about that too.
Brown eyes, green eyes, and blue eyes. I see a darkness in you. And in that darkness, eyes staring back at me. Brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes. Eyes you'll shut forever. We will meet again.
But an offhanded line of dialogue buried by several seasons of television is not sufficient setup for such a significant payoff. In addition to the lack of setup, the payoff of this subversion has no consequences. Arya gains no greater position or respect as a result of her actions, and the army of the dead are more or less forgotten about as the show progressed. Instead, the rest of the season is dedicated to Daenerys waging war against Cersei, and of course the innocent women and children of King's Landing. But I digress. The army of the dead being killed in a single dagger strike is an immensely significant subversion which does not have any lasting consequences. They are simply gone and more or less forgotten about by the characters on the show. Beyond the lack of setup for Arya's character, this subversion results in setup for a different character becoming disregarded. The Azor Ahai prophecy was a setup which had been alluded to several times on the show, particularly relating to the character of Stannis Baratheon and mentioned by Melisandre. Based on the aspects of the prophecy mentioned, it was relatively clear that Jon Snow was Azor Ahai, having returned from the dead and being in constant opposition of the White Walkers. He served as the connection between the living and the dead and fought on the wall to stop them from reaching the world. As the prophecy claims, if Azor Ahai falls, the world falls with him. These are elements of setup which foreshadow Jon being the one who kills the Night King. But all of this setup leads to nothing for his character. As a result of the subversion with Arya, Jon's setup becomes redundant. Now, would it have been possible for a character other than Jon to kill the Night King? Absolutely. But in order for this subversion to be effective, it would require both setup and consequences, something which would require work by the writers outside of a single episode. Instead, all of the setup for this subversion is established in the same episode the subversion is executed in, and there are no lasting consequences for the gargantuan turn of events. Subverting expectations is something which can make for unique and spectacular storytelling. But the key aspect of subversion to remember is that a subversion isn't effective in itself. A subversion with no setup and no consequences is simply surprising. But over time, this subversion will be looked at with disdain. However, when you set up a subversion with logical progression for both the plot and characters, the payoff will be all the more effective, and the audience will tend to remember the subversion more if you implement consequences of that payoff into the rest of your story. If you want to subvert the expectations of the audience, plan out your subversion in advance and drop hints for the subversion in earlier scenes. Then, make the subversion have lasting consequences for both the story and characters. That is how you can effectively subvert the audience's expectations.
You really have two choices there. You can ignore it and proceed with your plan, despite the fact that some people know where you're going. Or you can get all panicky and say, oh my God, they figured it out. I can't let that be. I'll have to change it. I'll have to go in a different direction. And I think some writers do that. And I think that's always a mistake.
Yeah.
You know, if you've planned your book that the butler did it, and then you read on the internet, someone has figured out that the butler did it, and you suddenly change in midstream and it was the chambermaid who did it, then you screw up the whole book because you get this foreshadowing early on and you've got these little clues you planted. Now they're dead ends and you have to introduce other clues and you're retconning. It's a mess.
And even though it has just now come to the forefront, it's a narrative that has been at the core of the story since the very beginning, having been centered around one character in particular, Jon Snow. And it's exactly when we focus our lens on his individual journey that we can retrace just how traditional the larger narrative has always been, and how it may very well reveal why Jon Snow is destined to win the Game of Thrones.
We hope to kind of avoid the expected, and Jon Snow has always been the hero, the one who's been the savior, but it just didn't seem right to us for this moment.
You're a funny man. Huh? A very funny man.